Audio Jungle.
We've got patient representatives, insurers, sometimes both in the same person, and provider and clinician. So I think we've got a broad perspective here. So a quick round of applause for our panel, and then we'll get into it. And start with you, Stephen. When we were back there, you raised an interesting point, which I want to pick you up on, which is, so far our discussions today, we've missed the point.
Well,
I'm putting you on the spot.
Yeah, fair enough.
You thought you said it to me privately,
right,
but
what we've missed is a discussion of sort of what's most important to patients. I think we've been touching on some things that are important to patients, which is, how long can I live? What kind of treatment is the right treatment for me? And those are really important questions that people obviously care about. But what's been missing is the entire patient experience. And we've been focusing on a very narrow vision of what's important to patients, rather than thinking about, what is the quality of life that you get with the extension of life, and how do we improve someone's quality of life as they're going through treatment for cancer, both to improve their quality of life from the cancer itself, from the treatment of the cancer that can make people feel terrible, and begin to really speak to what the patient experience of the entire illness is, rather than just focusing very narrowly.
Robin, your point of view, I mean, you have had cancer in the past, and so how has that shaped the kind of research you do, and what are you, what are the outcomes of that research?
Yeah, well, both as a nurse and as a cancer patient, I think that, nurses get to see the day-to-day experiences of the patient, and then when I became a cancer patient myself, it really became apparent that although it's true that I think for most cancer survivors and their families, the number one thing is wanting to live and wanting to have that tailored genomic profile that gets you your exact cure. Really what fills your life is all these other concerns. How am I going to pay for this? Who will watch my children while I'm getting chemo? How do I tell my children that I might die, or have that conversation? And we're doing a very bad job of that right now in oncology care. And, some of the recent work that I've done has to do with the financial impact of cancer treatment. And we talked about that a lot before in terms of the cost of drugs, but it's not just about the drugs. It's about, again, childcare. It's about employment issues if you're a younger person with cancer, or even now that people are becoming older parents and working longer. These are issues that are going to become increasingly common for people who are going through cancer treatment. And the reality is that they are having a huge impact on patients, and we're not even really quantifying them or measuring them. So even though it's great that we're starting to look into how big data can help us come up with innovations in cancer care, it would be great if we could measure more of those things that are important to cancer patients in a broader way, and not just focused on clinical outcomes.
Brian, you have the perspective of both someone who's had cancer and now an insurer.
Yes.
So,
well, one of the things I think that I learned, I run accountable care and value-based programs, and one of the first things I did when I started to look at doing this for my company is I had a team of 12 health economists and got to look at what is cancer in terms of a payer. What are the events that surround it? And much of today's conference has been around it's acute cancer care, it's expensive diagnostic procedures, it's expensive chemotherapy, it's the acute care. But one of the things that I learned is a lot of the cancer expense and a lot of the cancer activity really occurs in screening. There's a huge thing, and it affects patients hugely. There's a lot of sort of questionably appropriate screening, and there's things like, even when appropriate, the false positives involved. An issue is like mammography. In parts of my state, if the equivocal mammographies or screening mammographies that result in a subsequent diagnostic test exceed 15%. Just think of those women. Most of those come back, almost all of those come back negative, by the way. And just think of the impact on those women, the level of anxiety. That night that they got the report around their, around their dinner table, were they thinking, I may be saying goodbye to my family? What were the impacts of these things? And the amount of money that is wasted a lot. We see a lot of screening and subsequent follow-up testing for equivocals and false positives. And I think the impact of the patient is huge. The other thing we saw a lot that really affects the way cancer care is delivered is the post-acute episode, is after that, survivorship. If I'm a cancer survivor, I was a patient for 5 months. I plan on being a cancer survivor for at least 50 years. And, and during that time, the whole issues on the patient of knowing, is something coming back? I remember the first couple of years after my cancer, whenever I got a backache, I had bone mets. I didn't have a back sprain, I had bone metastases. And we see also screening out, I've seen patients from the data, somebody out 10, 11 years from fully treated Hodgkin's, who's still getting annual CAT scans by their primary care doc. God knows what the radiation burden is, and who knows the anxiety of each episode where that guy is coming back and waiting for the results. So I think those are some of the issues as you look at a patient and some of the things that we see as a payer, because as a payer, we see all the care that people get, because every time one of our patients has some contact with the medical system, chances are they sent us a bill, so we know what goes on.
Jamie, you again have this personal experience there, and then you've now you've set up a system to try to systematically gather what the patient perspective is and feed that back into R&D. Am I right in thinking? Yeah. So tell us a little bit about that. And
well, I was thinking about how to prepare for this, because at some level, I come from a culture where the goal is to make the drug or the diagnostic that delivers the actionable clinical insight that changes what's currently unactionable into something actionable. That's the miracle I've been working on for a long time. But with Stephen, I experienced that in a very different way. My brother had ALS, and I went through the whole journey with him in that context. And, in retrospect, despite having done, 5 experimental treatments, multiple INDs, first stem cell transplant in the field, the things that made his life great were things that you couldn't find anywhere else. And, it was things like, just once he was in a wheelchair on a ventilator, we made a rule that he needed to be able to roll out of the house in 1 minute. And that was the rule. And the reason was, if it took any longer than that, you never went anywhere. And so we'd set him up with the batteries and redundant equipment, and the car had all the redundant equipment in it, and it cost a few $1,000s to do that, but it meant that Stephen basically lived a normal life. I could call him up at 4 o'clock, say, let's go to the movies, and we could go to the movies, and without that, you couldn't go. It's a little tiny rule. Or, the craziest one was a toothbrush that had a suctioning tube in it, that when you were, as a paralyzed patient, brushing your teeth, instead of spitting, saliva and crest all over your clothes every single morning, you would be able to suction it while you were doing it and control it. And it turns out you couldn't buy one. You could only buy a gross, because that's what hospitals use. So we bought a gross, and we shared it with a bunch of other patients. And, that little 5 minutes of not being covered by toothpaste every morning. And, you think about what's the meaning of life, right? So I think that we as a family ended up balancing living well with everything that's been discussed here, all the advanced diagnostics and treatments and everything that were done right. But we had to drive that ourselves. And the system did not support that from an information standpoint. And, I'm a math guy. I mean, I just live and see math. I'm sitting in a hospital ER, and I'm calculating the costs per minute of finding a bed for my brother. I just run math algorithms all the time. And what I like about this problem is that there's so many stories. And by the way, they're often of nurses who are the ones that really, we call it healthcare, and the ones really providing care are the nurses. And the doctors are decision support engines, and the nurses are doing the care. They don't get credit for that, and that's actually where value is created. But if you look at this, the stories, the narrative of human interactions are amazing. They're all over our site. They're all over the system. But unlike discovery, and unlike all the other things, frankly, no one is holistically looking at what makes someone's life better. And a false biopsy that leads to a a false positive that leads to an unnecessary biopsy, that leads to a frequent surgical complication, that leads to loss of someone's life for months, and anxiety and interruption, and maybe loss of jobs, and we undercount that harm. We do not have a holistic view of what it's like to be a patient, and I'll state this sort of sadly. Patients like me largely works for the pharmaceutical industry, because they're largely the only ones that really want to know what the outcomes are and are willing to invest in it. And I'm sorry to state that. And they asked us a question a little while ago. It was Genentech asked us a question. Can you help us measure quality of care? And we want to look at how well it's being done in an institution. And we said, well, we don't really think it's a good institutional framework. Why don't we think about the journey of the patient from first diagnosis to where they are, and measure what contributes to that success or failure from the perspective of the patient? And they loved it, and they're letting us build it. I wish the rest of the system thought that way. I'm tired of hearing micro statistics about the benefit of this or the benefit of that in some self-selected, hyper-optimized context, and then overdriving that into the market and seeing people get harmed, and we measure it every day. And I think that we need to look at this holistically and force the system to.
That's very clear articulation of the issues. Stephen, did you want to say something?
Well, just that when you talked about sort of what's really important, what was important to your brother, for example, what's important to patients, it really is some of these other issues that are not the medical issues. And we think, I like to think of the work I do, palliative care, as being very, obviously it's very patient-oriented, but also very precise, thinking about precision medicine. And a lot of the discussion today has been, precision medicine focused on the genome. That's great. Where we can do it, but what we really want is care that is precise to the individual, that says, can you get out of your house in 1 minute? Who's going to take care of your children? And the healthcare system really doesn't look holistically at the person. And our goal in palliative care, and why we want to integrate it more into cancer care, is because it is trying to provide precision medicine for the whole person, rather than just isolating parts of a person and thinking that that's the way we should be treating.
Do we have any questions from anyone right now? Yeah.
Joseph Curtis, Cascade Therapeutics. The question about the holistic approach to palliative care, why are we restricting it just to individuals who are experiencing cancer? Why can't that be a system reset for how we deal with medical care across the whole country?
Yeah, great question. The only reason to talk about cancer is because this is war on cancer. But point well taken. We think about palliative care really for any serious illness, whether that's cancer, heart failure, chronic lung disease, cirrhosis, dementia, and integrating it early. I mean, what we're seeing is early integration of palliative care can really make a huge difference. There's a study from 2010 that was done right here in Boston, looking at people with newly diagnosed metastatic non-small cell lung cancer. They all got routine oncology care at Mass General. Half were randomly assigned to receive palliative care at the same time. And though the people who got randomly assigned to palliative care in addition, they had less pain, they had less depression, they had better quality of life, and they lived longer by almost 3 months. So early integration, simultaneous care can have a profound improvement in all the things that we care about that are important to us as individuals and to patients. And it begs the question why that's not routinely available anymore. We like to say if it was a drug, it would be, everybody would get it. We'd give it for pancreatic cancer and renal cancer and melanoma. But here it is, it's a service, it's a team, it's expertise, it's relationship, and it's not well integrated. And people will argue, well, there's no financial model for it, but better quality should find a way to get paid for.
So, go on, sir.
There's a variable there that I wanted to ask. I think part of your question is why is it branded palliative care? And I think that that's necessary because every field needs to be some brand to be studied and get funded. But when we started Patients Like Me, we used sort of Maslow's hierarchy of needs as sort of as the design exercise. And for those of you who don't know, it's sort of, you go from essentially the need to breathe to self-actualization in this historical perspective. And what we found was that patients came to our site to thrive. They wanted to learn how to live well. We called that thriving. They agree with the word, but and there wasn't in their mind this rigid priority. First, I will spend all my time not dying, and then I will spend all of my time reducing my symptomology or the side effects of my drugs, and then I will figure out how to maximize my ability. What they said is, I want to live well, and live well had a personalized context that's unique to each individual. And individual needs and ability, individual things that they could tolerate in suffering. And, I think that the model we have now, where what we value is what we can impose upon the system from the outside in not dying or some measure of suffering, which is really all we measure in trials, as opposed to, did someone that received this in some realistic context actually thrive more, have a better life in some way that was worth something to them? And I think that palliative care is essentially doing that. It just happens, as you said, to be restricted to the last 90 days of our life or whatever it is, which is dumb. We should do that the whole time. But I don't know how to, I think that, I don't know what we do in the economics. I was going to say, we're at the Economist, right? Yeah. So the reason we're the last panel, and patient value, the experience of having cancer is the last thing. Maybe you could say it's the most important. I think it probably means it didn't get to set the tone of the meeting, maybe we should have, is because there's no economics in making patients well. And that's why we work largely for the drug industry. And I think we have to just face that reality and be honest about it to patients in that context.
Can I just, I like everything you said except the 90-day comment.
Okay.
So I was
being pejorative. I was deliberately being pejorative.
Thank you. But I just want to clarify. There is no limit. If you think about hospice, for example, there is a 6-month prognosis that's required by Medicare and so on. But that's not true for palliative care. And we really think of a model that begins to deliver palliative care from the moment of diagnosis. And so there is no restriction. There is no limit on when it can be provided.
Thank you for the correction.
Any other questions?
Yeah, when Robin talked about her concerns as a cancer patient about how am I going to pay my bills, all the other daily pieces there, I know that big pharma can't satisfy or solve those problems, but what about addressing some of that with CMS? What about addressing some of that with the social safety nets in the country? Part of the Affordable Care Act, part of the rationale for that was driven by the very excessive high numbers of bankruptcies driven by medical catastrophes experienced by families. So I understand the focus is cancer, palliative care, but we have an opportunity as a community to articulate this message, the value of this message, to the broader community about how we need to basically restructure the way the care is given across the board in our communities. That's all.
Can I comment on that a little bit as a payer? One of the real economic costs, really, of the cancer episode, and I think one of the other speakers, I think the gentleman from Express Scripts today mentioned, is during this cancer episode, under currently, if you are insured in this country, your out-of-pocket is usually satisfied within that episode. It is very expensive, but once you've spent your $8,000 out of pocket, that's it. The other economic costs, the loss of job, the need for other services at home, for maybe help to take care of your kids, your inability, even if you don't lose your job, your inability to function as well. That's a lot of the economic burden. It isn't what's one thing that under the ACA plans, with out-of-pocket maximums under most of these, the episode of cancer itself, the medical cost, yes, it's a burden to a lot of middle class and working class families, but it's not that high. It's the other components, the other economic components, which is very important.
Yeah, and I think that, a lot of work has shown that the economic impact continues years, down the road. Cancer survivors have increased out-of-pocket costs for, follow-up care for years, and also can often have an impact on their employment years down the road from, late long-term side effects of treatment. So I think, to your point, there's definitely a lot that could be done differently to help more with those kinds of situations. And I think as we have these kinds of conversations about innovative models and patients sharing data and learning from the data that they're sharing, we have to always keep disparities in mind as well, because part of me worries that we're creating these increasingly cutting edge and tech savvy pockets of care while the rest of the country doesn't get even basic quality, even things that we've known for years. I mean, if you look at something like Choosing Wisely, that's meant to help inform decision making and lower costs. I mean, those are all things that oncologists should not have been doing for years anyway, right? So how do we get most people in the country who are being treated for cancer just basic quality care? Never mind these fantastic innovations, which I don't want to stop by any means, because we do benefit from them, but not equally. And I think that's always has to be on our minds.
So I just want to press it. I mean, it's not an either or, is it? I mean, we've been
not
talking
an
a lot
either
about precision medicine and expensive treatments and screening programs and so on, but you're not talking about either or here.
No, but I do feel that I go to ASCO conferences and I see very cool things that are happening at places that most people can't reach. There are not that many comprehensive cancer centers in the country, and most cancer patients aren't being treated there, and they don't even come close to getting the kinds of services that are offered there, and their outcomes aren't as good.
But doesn't that come to your point about economics?
I mean, I think that actually it is not only not about either or. I mean, it's actually worse than that. The whole house of cards of biomedical research and the pricing, and anyone that watched the stock market and the biotech index yesterday knows this well, is built on this sort of isolated fiction of value that is determined by these sort of arbitrary, and I love the FDA, so I don't mean this as a criticism, but sort of FDA signalable events that you isolate, and not having any value index means that we have really stupid conversations, and the stupid conversations are going to collapse the economics of medicine. And I don't think we spend too much money in healthcare. I think we could almost spend more money in healthcare. I want to live a healthy life. I mean, a friend of mine is an investor named Tom DeLay, and he was at a dinner once. He said, you guys keep talking about spending less like you want less health. I don't know what your problem is. I want more. What I want is better value for money. And I think that if we don't find a way to put the measured value of effective palliative care in extending quality life for someone dealing with cancer next to the relative value of the new image contrast agent or the relative value of the new CTLA-4 inhibitor, then we will lose the value of the CTLA-4 inhibitor and the new contrast agent, because it's living in a fiction that's not indexed to human good in a real way. And so if you care about the medicine, if you care about the diagnostic, and that's what I spend my life caring about, if you can't put that up against another thing, and to be really pointed about this, I mean, it's interesting. There was this whole screaming match about Sovaldi and the price of this drug for curing Hep C, and I looked at the economics. I'm like, this is the deal of the century. Like $84,000, you cure a disease in a few weeks, and you don't have a transplant, and healthcare costs go down. I mean, it's the deal of the century. Let's talk about MS drugs that modify disease 10% and cost $50,000 a year, and you take for a decade. Like, where do you want the value here? And I think that the lack of anchoring on value means that this whole industry that I love dearly is in threat. And I think the other part about this that's really critical is it isn't actually the diagnostics and the drugs that are collapsing the system's cost. It's failed inefficiency within the system itself. It's the overuse of diagnostics. It's the overuse of the system in inappropriate ways that are driving it. And so this is all lacking holistic economics. And this is what you're trying to do with your economists, and you just don't have the data to make the right calculations. You know what it costs, but you don't know what it's worth, right? And we need to bring that to the world and invest in that, and that's the sort of mission that I try to spend my life on holistically. I don't care about one drug or one disease. I care about everything in context and trying to bring that to bear. And it's a problem we as a society don't invest anything or much in, depressingly.